Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks podcast powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. Happy as always to have you on board the podcast wherever and however you may be listening to the show. BYU's perfect season ends. The Cougars fall to Kansas 17-13. Going to unpack all my thoughts here in this edition of the show. You can follow me on X, Instagram, at Mitch_Harper. Follow KSL Sports as well, at KSL Sports on all the social media handles. So, Cougs are now 9-1, and that was as disappointing of an offensive performance as I've seen in quite some time from BYU. You probably got to go back to maybe the Utah game wasn't much better. Maybe the SMU game. The offense struggled mightily. You go into the red zone 4 times and only end up with 6 points, you're not going to win many games, period. That has to be fixed for BYU. Because Kansas, they were fine. I mean, they were nothing spectacular. But you think about the effort that BYU's defense gave, holding Kansas to 242 total yards. You would have told me that before the game. I would have thought, oh, wow, BYU wins this 28-10, maybe 35-17, somewhere in there. BYU would have ran away with this thing, but they didn't. And there's some real concern, I think, for BYU's offense going forward. Now, I will say, before I dive in deep into the game, I do believe that a loss could be a good thing for this BYU team. At practice this week, it just felt a little tense, and even Aaron Roderick gave a glimpse into some of the issues for this team, that it was a pretty beat-up team, as he noted. I mean, physically, they were drained after that Utah game, and I was always leery of the Utah game being a hangover spot, but I'd rather you see the hangover on November 16th rather than potentially a Big 12 championship game appearance. Now, you lost your margin for error a little bit when it comes to getting to that Big 12 championship game. Your one loss is now out the door. But you think about the how this schedule sets up. Okay. Losing this game to a team in Kansas, and I know that ultimately the playoff committee is not going to respect BYU. Who cares about that aspect? You've lost your chance at any hopes of an at-large playoff bid, and honestly, that's just what it is. That's how this system was structured, and Big 12 teams are barely going to get at-large bids. So be it. But you lose to a Kansas team that, man, the ESPN broadcast was saying, this might be the best 3-6 team in college football. Ugh. Hate that commentary, but you lose that game. Okay, fine. Well, next week, you play 8-2 Arizona State. Had you beat Kansas instead and then lost to Arizona State, what would the narrative have been? Oh, you can't beat good teams. That's what the knock would have been on BYU. Oh, you can beat bad teams, can't beat good teams. Well, you have a chance now next week to go into Tempe and erase any of the ill will from this Kansas game by going to beat the Sun Devils. But this Kansas game, there's a lot to work on coming out of this because BYU's offense is struggling. And it's not just Jake Retzloff, it's the whole operation. I think it was the play calling. I think it was real issues there. Aaron Roderick, I don't like that fade play call. I know a lot of Cougar fans did not like that at the end of the second quarter. And I think one of my big issues with that is, well, one, it didn't work against Utah. I got picked off in that 2-point conversion attempt. 2, I don't like the personnel selection. Don't let it be Mata'ava Ta'ase. You've got Chase Roberts. You've got Darius Lassiter. Keelan Marion has played some really good football over the last 4 weeks. Go to one of those guys. Maybe JoJo Phillips as well. I felt like BYU at times forgets about their personnel, the guys that got them to this spot. And look, Taase's done a nice job this season. He's got a handful of touchdown grabs, but he's not going to be the first name, maybe the first 5 names you bring up for the best receiving targets on this BYU football team. So that was one thing that I just didn't like at all. And I thought too much of the jet sweeps, and maybe it was a tip of the cap to Jeff Grimes and Kansas who was in the building, but that jet sweep is a maddening situation to me. But I also thought as well offensively for BYU that the tempo that they played with just felt a little slow. The whole stadium felt a little bit dead. Now, cold weather, not much to cheer about for the fans. I get it. But it didn't feel electric in that stadium like it's been in previous games. And honestly, years past. It just didn't have that same juice, that same fight and energy that you've grown accustomed to. I mean, BYU has established a thing where it's BYU at night. Vampire Cougs, here we go. And it just didn't feel like they have that energy in that stadium all night long. But the pace of the team, I just thought was slow. There was no urgency. There was no... Because you saw at the end of the game in the fourth quarter, that's kind of what the offense to me should look like. Where you got some pace, you got a little bit of rhythm, there's a belief factor. There just wasn't much of that the rest of the game. I like the effort to establish the ground attack, which LJ Martin, 15 carries. Like, I'm okay with LJ Martin getting 20 carries. That guy's going to get you 5 yards a pop. But I thought that third quarter drive where you go 17 plays and you've exhausted more than 10 minutes of game action and you only end up with a field goal, that was a loss to me. That was an absolute loss and a win for Kansas. Because Kansas had shown an ability to have a bit of a quick strike offense, and I think they had a hope and a belief that they could respond quickly. Didn't work out. And then, of course, the special teams, well, not special teams, it was a special teams type play from Kansas, fourth down, Jalen Daniels with the pooch punt, and the punt lands on the helmet of Evan Johnson. Jacob Robinson tries to recover the loose ball. It squirms out, and Kansas then recovers from the 3-yard line of BYU. The luck, I don't want to say luck because BYU had to have execution to make some of those plays happen against Kansas State, against Arizona, against UCF, against Utah even. But the good fortunes that had been on BYU's side flipped completely on that one. And it just felt like in that moment, because one play later, Devin Neal finds pay dirt and finds the end zone. He had 2 touchdowns on the night. And Kansas goes up after that touchdown score. That was a moment where you just felt like, this isn't going to be BYU's night. But then they had that final drive, and it gave you belief. And they get to a 3rd and 6. 3rd and 6. BYU runs an option pitch, which has worked so effectively this year. But there's been a common tendency that they always run that play on 3rd down. Credit to Kansas. They saw it coming a mile away, and they were well prepared for that Hinckley-Ropati pitch, and it got stuffed. And then BYU has a false start penalty, and suddenly it's 4th and 11. Jake Retzlaff passes the football to Chase Roberts short of the sticks. It was just that night for BYU. Now, you end up with 354 total yards. You outgain Kansas by 112 yards. 23 first downs to 13 for Kansas. BYU only 3 of 10 on 3rd downs. Kansas not much better, 4 of 12. But they come up short. And now it's back to the drawing board for this BYU team to try to get this fixed. The offense has got some issues here suddenly. And they've got to bounce back in short order because everything's still in front of them. They can still get to the Big 12 championship game. They can still have a chance to play Colorado. This league is wild. Chaos is bound to happen, but I don't think you can assume Colorado is going to drop many more games. Not that there's really the tiebreaker factor with Colorado, but you lose the game next week against ASU, that's basically an elimination game because then ASU will have the tiebreaker on BYU, and that is big. But again, the positive is if you win that game, well, you're back in the good graces of everyone, and you're thinking, oh, BYU just had a little bit of a blip on the radar, and they're back on track and ready to roll for the final stretch. Jake Retzlaff finishes 18 of 28, 192 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. I thought Jake lacked a little bit of velocity, the power behind some of his throws. Now, a few of them, I think they were tipped at the line of scrimmage by Kansas defenders, but I thought it was kind of noteworthy at the end of this first half. Jake was almost nursing his left arm, left shoulder, left side of his body. He got a little bit banged up, and it just feels like that's something to monitor going forward. He had that same situation happen against Oklahoma State last month, where at the end of the first half, similar spot as the Kansas game, he was kind of banged up on his left side. Now, non-throwing, sure, but clearly, like anyone at this late in the season, he's banged up. And, I thought that he had some good passes late, but there's got to be better overall execution going forward. And it just shows you, too, to be a championship team, to be an undefeated football team, man, it takes a lot. You have got to be just operating at such a high level. It is a tough, tough deal to have happen. And BYU comes up short this week. But on the flip side, too, there were some passes that Jake had where they were deep balls and they were just inaccurate. Keelan Marion had a deep pass, I think, in the opening drive. Keelan just didn't know where it was. But then there was a deep ball to Darius Lassiter. Darius was wide open, and Jake just kind of overshot him. So that one, he had a little bit more power on that throw. But just they were not completely dialed in. I mean, the accuracy just wasn't there as much as we've seen in the past from Jake in this BYU offense. It was interesting during the ESPN broadcast, Quint Kucinich, he roasted the field service once again. We're once again, despite a new playing field, talking about the playing surface. And then after the game, no one was allowed to walk on the grass. Everyone could only walk on the perimeter of the field. But the end zones were a mess. The paint was a mess. I didn't see much slippage this time, which should be noted. We weren't talking about you got to have studs. You got to have the right cleats. We weren't talking about that this year, but it was a very wet playing surface once again. I don't know if it's just the climate of BYU or Provo, but man, something is wrong late in November when it comes to BYU's playing surfaces. It's got to get fixed. There were some plays in this game, too, that were any, momentum for BYU moments. Kansas just had answers. That first drive, that was a little bit questionable. Jalen Daniels completed a pass to Quentin Skinner. It was a gain of 29 yards. It looked like he pushed off on Mark Collins. The play was under review. Of course, it wasn't reviewed for pass interference, but it was reviewed for whether or not he was in bounds. The officials called it as it stands. It was a little bit too close, but that was a big deflating moment. And then Skinner had another one. I believe it was a 3rd and 11, and it was in the fourth quarter, and he picks it up. Mark Collins was in coverage. It was just an insane catch. And, Kansas didn't ultimately do anything on that drive. Mark Collins, on the next third down, got an interception, but it just put them in a situation where the field, they were a little bit farther down than being deep in their own territory because being deep in your own territory. You could have shanked a punt, which a Kansas punter did earlier in the game where they only had like a 30-yard something punt. That could have been big had you got that stop in that 3rd and 11, but it just wasn't meant to be for BYU. The following possession after the Mark Collins interception, BYU had to punt. The following drive after the Mark Collins interception, BYU had to punt. There was an offsides called on Kansas. It felt like that was a makeup penalty. Now, granted, BYU declined that one, but I think it was the previous drive. Kansas had what looked like an offsides, but it wasn't called. BYU, I think, assumed it was a free play. Kalani was pretty fired up with the refs. That was never called. But on that drive, Keelan Marion had a drop pass. 3rd and 11, BYU had a throw. I think it was intended to Keanu Hill, and that was one of those balls again where was Jake throwing it to? That just did not look good at all. And then BYU couldn't capitalize off the pick from Mark Collins, and they had to punt. Some individual players that I thought kind of caught my attention in the game. One, Tyler Batty. I thought he had a really good game. One of the best games statistically for him this season. He's had some big games. It just hasn't always equaled TFLs, sacks, things like that. But he was really big on Saturday night against Kansas. A guy that got a lot of run, Miles Hall, a redshirt freshman from Skyline High School. He had a number change from number 30 to 46. And, in the pregame, it wasn't, garnering any headlines, but it highlights that you have to dig into the depth a little bit. Sione Moa, linebacker, not the running back, he was out. Sialia Serra out once again. He was out the Utah game as well. So that inside linebacker spot, they've had to dig into their depth. And after Harrison Taggart, suddenly you're going to Miles Hall. So BYU turns to Miles Hall in a lot of stretches as a breather for Harrison Taggart, and he played okay. I thought he did okay. I mean, still probably room to improve, but I think he did a nice job. Hall's going to be a really good athlete for BYU, and he's going to be one to monitor down the road for the Cougars. Crew Wakely left the game early. I thought that was noteworthy. Falatau Satuala replaced him, and then it became kind of a safety by committee spot for BYU on the back end of that defense. So that's going to be something to monitor this week. Mata'ava Ta'ase got a little bit dinged up early, but of course came back into the game. But for the most part, not many players went into the medical tent, which, if you're going to look at the positives from this game, I think that was a definite positive for BYU, that they didn't seem to have too many injuries coming out of that game. And I think that's a good thing as you get ready for an Arizona State game where the weather's going to be assumed a lot warmer, and maybe you can, play in a better playing surface and things like that. So I think that was of positive note for BYU coming out of that Kansas game. But ultimately, BYU falls to the Kansas Jayhawks 17-13. Cougs are now 9-1, 6-1 in Big 12 play. And I got to say, kind of as I wrap this up, it is fun just to be in a championship race again. Even last year, there wasn't, this monitoring of standings. It was just, BYU's going through the motions as a first-year Big 12 team struggling down to the finish on a 5-game skid. This year, it's about championship hunt, standing watch, looking at tiebreakers. BYU hasn't done this in 15 years. It's been a long time since they've been doing this, so I think that's pretty fun. And it sets up a huge game, as I've noted, against Arizona State in Tempe. I'll be down there at Mountain America Stadium. I will always call it, though, Sun Devil Stadium. That's what it should be called. Tempe, Arizona, BYU, and ASU for the first time down there since 1997. That feels so weird that the Cougs haven't been there that long, but they will be back in Tempe next week. And Kenny Dillingham said after that Kansas State win, if that victory over the Wildcats doesn't, quote, activate the Valley, I don't know what will. So I expect probably a big crowd for BYU and ASU, because you factor in the BYU fans and then Arizona State's feeling good about themselves. It should be an electric atmosphere in Tempe. So BYU got to let this one be flushed away against Kansas, learn from it, but bounce back quickly to get ready for the home stretch in Big 12 play. But that's going to do it for this edition of the Cougar Tracks podcast. I'll talk to you on Monday night on Cougar Nation and then throughout the week here on the Cougar Tracks podcast. And it's always powered by KSLSports.com.